I'm Alex Runswick and I'm Senior Advocacy Manager at Transparency International UK. Thank you very much everyone for coming to today's event, and of course to Big Tent for their support in hosting the event. You'll have seen from the images that were in the presentation as you arrived that Clive Betts had been due to attend today, and he's had to send his apologies. He was very much hoping to be here but wasn't able to be on the day. So a little bit about Transparency International and the context for the event. Transparency International UK is one of the UK's leading anti-corruption organisations. We raise awareness about corruption, advocate for reform, and act as a leading centre of anti-corruption expertise in the UK. We are also part of the Global Transparency International movement, which has over 100 chapters worldwide. One of the areas we've been researching is corruption risks in major planning decisions taken at a local government level. Planning decisions are always some of the most contentious and difficult aspects of local government. From small extensions to major developments, tensions can run high. Too often, many local residents feel that their power to intervene and influence planning decisions is limited by commercial and more wealthy interests. Is this the case? Our expert panel is going to reflect on Transparency International's recent report, Permission Accomplished, which explores what the risks of corruption are in planning decisions at in local government and how we can reduce those risks. We're going to start with a presentation about the report and have a short response from each of our panellists. We'll then hear from two councillors, Councillor Paul Miller and Councillor Leslie Wyber, about the work that they've been doing on this in Devon and Folkestone and Hythe respectively. And then, as Susie's already mentioned, we'll have the opportunity to move to questions. We'll start with the questions that were submitted in advance and then take any additional questions that you want to ask in the chat box. So all that's left for me to do is to introduce our panel. So John Penrose MP is the Prime Minister's anti-corruption champion. He plays a key role in challenging and supporting the government to implement the UK's anti-corruption strategy. He represents this agenda in the UK and internationally and ensures that concerns of key stakeholders are considered in the government's approach to tackling corruption. He's been a Conservative MP for Weston-super-Mare since 2005, following a wide-ranging business career. Liz David Barrett is Professor of Governance and Integrity at the University of Sussex and Director of the Centre for the Study of Corruption. Her research focuses mainly on corruption risks arising at the interface between business and politics and on the effectiveness of anti-corruption policy in these areas. Rachel Davies-Tika is Head of Advocacy at Transparency International UK. Her work focuses on UK money laundering and asset recovery, political corruption, open governance, and the UK government's record on anti-corruption. She is the co-chair of the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition, a collection of like-minded British NGOs who work on the issue of corruption, and sits on the steering group of the UK Open Government Network. Over to you, Rachel.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Alex. I think Trin is going to bring up some slides. We'll just wait for those. I can just kick off, Trin, and if you just skip to the second slide once they're up. So thank you all for coming and for being here. I'm aware it's half-term week, so some of you are probably quite busy, so thank you for your time. I'm going to start off talking about a couple of case studies, a couple of incidents that you may already be aware of. In 2019, the SFO announced they were investigating a development in Liverpool. After receiving planning consent, the developer filed for insolvency, which may have lost investors up to £200 million. One of the developers behind the failed project donated almost £2,000 to the local constituency Labour Party after planning permission was authorised. And local campaigners in Liverpool have claimed that this raises questions about the relationship between the developers and the local politicians. And it's worth noting that there were no minutes taken at meetings between the developers, councillors and their officials. To London, and in 2018, a national newspaper reported that a local Conservative councillor, Westminster's then deputy leader and recent chair of its planning committee, had declared receiving 514 gifts and hospitality over 3 years, amounting to what we estimate to be around £13,000. In 2016 alone, this included gifts and hospitality from 58 successful applicants for planning permission, and a subsequent report recommended that Westminster needed to fundamentally rethink its stance on hospitality, and I quote, put more emphasis on councillors questioning upfront what value accepting offers of hospitality would add to the decision-making process. If we look at these cases, and let's take Liverpool first, I think even if we take a very generous view of what happened and we take the accused at their word, they've claimed they've done nothing wrong. At the very least, I think this case shows how public trust in the process can be utterly devastated if there's a lack of transparency and the right protocols and controls aren't in place. If we look at the Westminster case, I think this is a good example of how a rotten culture can really develop over time due to insufficient protocols. You know, where accepting £10,000 plus in gifts and hospitality is seen as completely acceptable by those in senior positions. You know, the UK is in a situation right now where it's suffering a housing crisis, where there's a shortage of homes. And of course, major housing developments are part of the solution to this, but they can also be quite contentious for local communities. And as recent scandals have shown, you know, the conduct of councillors in this process can at best give the impression of corruption at times, and at worst constitute actual wrongdoing. And this mistrust in the planning system can undermine billions of pounds of investment and prevent, of course, the delivery of new homes. If I could have the next slide, please, Joan, that'd be great. So we have recently released some research. We did an analysis of corruption risks within planning decisions at local government level. We assessed 50 councils in England with planning responsibilities for housing and scored them on how well they manage corruption risks using a scale of 0, indicating poor, to 100, which indicates that the council meets good practice. Unfortunately, all councils show significant room for improvement with an average score of just 38 out of 100. If we could skip to the next slide. Thank you. We identified 5 major corruption risks in planning decisions. The first, bribery and excessive gifts in hospitality. And of course, as many of you are probably aware, while convictions for domestic bribery are not very common in the UK, it is the most serious form of alleged corruption that we found in planning decisions. Our research also identified that indicators of potential bribery, such as excessive hospitality or curiously timed political donations, have also arisen in certain parts of the country. In our case analysis, we identified 3 incidents involving alleged or proven bribery, and also questions raised about gifts and hospitality given to key councillors in 4 others. I think it's worth just mentioning briefly, there is a real disparity between different local authorities on gifts and hospitality. For example, some don't even require councillors to register this information, and we might get into the detail of that some more during the Q&A. The second major risk we identified is secretive lobbying. So we believe transparency over lobbying is critical to providing confidence in the integrity of major decisions. And the LGA recommends that when meeting with developers, council officers should be present, notes should be taken, and those notes should be published. It's worth noting there are some good examples of really good practice. For example, Portsmouth Council goes even further than this and actually takes notes for telephone conversations and makes those available too. However, overall in our analysis, we found that only 2 local authorities within our sample explicitly required all 3 of these requirements from the LGA when engaging developers and their agents. The third major risk area is around conflicts of interest. We found that 72 current councillors are or used to be employed by companies working in the housing or planning industry whilst holding public office. 32 of these hold critical decision-making positions in their local planning system whilst also working for developers. Number 4, related to this, is the abuse of the revolving door. So that's the movement of individuals from the public and private sector, either way. We found at least 120 councillors moved between public office and private employment in the planning sector over the past decade. And it is worth noting, of course, the revolving door can be a really positive thing. For example, it can increase understanding and communication between the private and the public sector. However, it does carry a corruption risk if it's not managed properly. So, for example, councillors may be influenced in decision-making by past or prospective employers. And unfortunately, in our analysis, only 4 councils showed kind of any sign of recognition and attempt to address the conflicts of interest that may arise when councillors move between public and private office. The fifth and final corruption risk we identified is around weak oversight of big decisions. So for example, only 6 of the 50 local authorities required councillors to undertake compulsory training on probity in the planning process. It's worth noting that there are systematic weaknesses across the board in local government defences against impropriety. This problem is not confined to one political party or one region. It requires a cross-party, cross-country response. We also recognise that being a local councillor is not an easy job. Councillors work part-time hours and often need to seek other employment in order to make ends meet. And it's not like councils are necessarily working with huge budgets to make big changes. This is why we are recommending some simple, low-cost steps that we think local councils can take to protect themselves against corruption risks and also hopefully improve public trust in local decision-making around planning. If I can have the next slide. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through each of these 10 recommendations in detail. I'll direct you towards our report where you can find out more information about these. But we've made 10 recommendations in terms of how local authorities can do this, and all these recommendations reinforce existing guidance and good practice recommended by others, such as the LGA, for example. And I'm just going to highlight 3 recommendations very quickly. On engaging external contacts and the risks around that, we think the local authorities should be required by law to establish a register of gifts and hospitality, as not all do at the moment. Around managing conflicts of interest, we think that all councillors should be prohibited from undertaking lobbying or advisory work relating to their duties on behalf of clients. And in terms of strengthening that oversight, we think that local authorities should increase transparency over investigations and enforcement action to provide a deterrent against future breaches of the rules. But I think this would also help demonstrate actions that local authorities are taking and would hopefully build public trust. I just want to quickly end on a positive note. Change can happen, and indeed it is. I think it's worth highlighting that East Devon District Council have made some great strides forward in response to some of these recommendations already, and I believe we'll be hearing from them a bit later. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rachel. If I can now ask John to respond to Rachel's presentation.
Well, thank you very much, and Rachel, thank you for that presentation. And some pretty scary conclusions in that. With an average score of 38, that's clearly a sort of shot across all our collective bows about the scale of the challenge. I'm also pleased, though, to hear you say that the vast majority of councillors are not only working part-time, they are trying to do the right thing and are sort of trying to give something back to their communities. So to your point about culture, yes, there will be examples of rotten cultures developing, and that's what you'd expect with several hundred different organisations, local authorities around the country at different levels. So there's going to be a spectrum. But it is just worthwhile pointing out that for an awful lot of them, there are run and led and peopled by individuals who are trying to do the right thing and are sort of trying to be honest and all those sensible things. But, and again, this comes back to your point, this is absolutely critical because the planning decision, permission being granted, is one of the biggest public creations of value. In the moment when permission is granted, it transforms the economics of a piece of land or a site. In some cases by 100-fold, by 200-fold or more, depending on what the current level of permission is and what the permission is being granted to. And there are huge amounts of money either invested on speculation or in trying to crystallize that value. So it is clearly an area where the corruption risks are just inherently high. Just before I go on, it's I think interesting to just consider that some of the proposals which are currently going through Parliament and being considered by Parliament for changes and reforms to the planning law, particularly around some of the things about permitted development and development codes and minimum space standards and so forth, may actually improve things a little bit by having a pre-approval status, effectively saying if your development, it's mainly for smaller developments, the permitted development stuff, but if your change to a particular site satisfies the following preconditions and satisfies the local council's development code, which is set out over here is publicly visible, then it will be approved. Now that reduces dramatically the nexus in which corruption can try and get a purchase. It isn't complete. It certainly doesn't apply to some of the biggest decisions, but that one change, for an awful lot of the smaller decisions, could make an enormous difference just on its own. There are other things which are being considered as well, which are not yet not yet firm proposals, but are being debated certainly, about trying to change some of the Section 106 and some of the community infrastructure levy proposals in order to capture some of the value that is being created when you make the planning decision and grant permission. And again, if you can turn some of those into a pre-approval tariff, again, it reduces the scope for discussion, it reduces the scope for lobbying, it reduces the scope for negotiation, and again, just shrinks the available area in which corruptors can try and operate. And so there are some systematic things, there are some design things that we can design safety into the process, some of which are already underway, some of which are still in the realms of debate, but which I don't think we should lose sight of, because that kind of just reduces the overall risk level before we even get started. Final thought I will just add, and then I will hand the floor over to others. An awful lot of the risks that Rachel and Transparency International just outlined are not new. They are risks which Parliament, for example, has tried to grapple with varying degrees of success over decades, and there have been examples. That's why you have registers of MPs' interests. That's why ministers have a ministerial code and have to have meetings minuted, and all those other things, and their meeting schedule has to be published as well. So this isn't a set of problems to which there are no answers. There are lots of answers out there, and there is good practice which can be already copied or just cloned for anybody who wants to do it. Rachel gave a really good example of, I think it was Portsmouth Council, was it, Rachel? You mentioned which reports on, even phone conversations between councillors. So this isn't something where we have to invent a brand new corpus of answers. They exist. Some of them exist in Westminster. Some of them exist in other councils, high-functioning councils around the country. And so therefore, there's an enormous amount of progress that we can make just by getting most people to do what some of the better ones are doing already. And actually, I think most of them will want to, because it protects the councillors themselves. It protects their personal reputations. It protects their financial reputations as well. And most ministers, if you ask them, do you want to have a civil service that will flag up to you when there may be a problem here and tell you in advance so that you can recuse yourself or step away from something, or make sure you do something in a way which is going to avoid a problem before it ever happens? Most ministers will say, hell yeah, I really want that, because it makes my life safer, it makes my job easier to do, and it just means that I'm much more likely to get to the right answer cleanly. Councillors are the same. Councillors will have exactly the same motivations and exactly the same fears as well. So if we can come up with something which is pre-baked as good practice, and as I said, it exists already in councils like Portsmouth and many others as well, then I think that this is not something which is a rocket science. This is just a question of finding good practice and spreading it. And that won't be a perfect answer. I'm sure there will still be things which Rachel will gnash her teeth over, and I will gnash my teeth over as well. But my goodness me, wouldn't it be great to just pull up the skirts of the long tail shorten that long tail of poor performing high risk councils and raise that average score from 38 to something higher? That would just be an enormous and a welcome step forward on its own.
Thanks very much, John. If I can now ask Liz to respond to Rachel.
Thanks very much, Alex. Yeah, congratulations on this great report to TI UK. I was involved in researching and writing a report for TI back in 2013, which was about corruption risks in local government. And there we identified 3 areas which were most prone to risk. One of them was planning permission, another social housing, and the third was public procurement. And in those areas at that time, what we found were conditions that were really conducive to corruption. Low levels of transparency, poor external scrutiny, evidence that there were local networks of cronyism, and also evidence that the outsourcing of public services was undermining public accountability. We also warned in that report that the risks of corruption were in fact mounting, and that was because of several factors at the time. One was austerity, which was just eroding the capacity of councils to do internal controls. They simply were under pressure financially, and they tended to cut the back office functions rather than the front office public service delivery. The Audit Commission had been abolished, which had reduced the potential for there to be an external body that had an overview of where the risks were. The National Code of Conduct for councillors had been withdrawn, and we were left with a situation in which there was absolutely no requirement for councils to even have a standards committee or a gifts register. No requirement to have a standards committee or a gifts register, just to emphasise, that seems pretty incredible, I think. On top of that, I think there was a reluctance to investigate alleged wrongdoing, perhaps, and often a denial that corruption was an issue at all. Okay, we're 7 years on. I think this new report from TI provides evidence that the risks have indeed mounted. They've also intersected with a housing crisis that was ongoing and has become worse in that 7 years. And I think, one of the things that is great about the report is that it provides clear evidence of the impact of not taking action to address corruption risks. And it also shows that corruption is not just some abstract white-collar problem. It leads to public policy being made and public funds being spent in ways that are not in the public interest. So councils continue to have significant discretionary power over many aspects of planning decisions. And as John said, we know that where there's discretionary power, there is often the potential for a corruption risk. Concretely, what that means is that there's potential for property developers to improperly influence decisions. They might do it by using connections to lean on decision makers. They might do it by offering bribes, not necessarily money, but can be jobs to councillors for during or after they leave office. Of course, we know that a lot of councillors have jobs with property companies whilst they're in office. The TI report shows that. It might be by wining and dining councillors into a position where they feel obliged to abuse their office to help. And there are several areas where this discretion can occur. It can be in the planning decisions themselves, but it can also be in decisions around change of use, whether a piece of land can be used only for industrial building or whether it can be used for housing. That's a really critical decision that property developers might want to influence. There's decisions around these Section 106 commitments where developers promise to give back to the local community, and also the monitoring then of those commitments. And there's decisions around whether the requirements to build a certain amount of affordable housing are put into contracts and whether they are actually monitored again and enforced. So there's several areas, I think, where there is still a lot of discretion. And what we really need, and what I think the TI report shows, is that there are actually some quite simple fixes that we could do to reduce the amount of discretion or to just make it more transparent so that we as the public can much better hold to account those decision makers.
Thanks very much, Liz. That's really helpful to have some of the longer term context. As Rachel mentioned earlier, Councillor Paul Miller in East Devon Council has been doing some work on this. I'd really like to have a few brief comments from him if we can.
Okay, yeah, very happy to. Thank you very much for inviting me. Some really interesting contributions so far. First, a bit of background about where East Devon has come from. In 2012, East Devon made the headlines after one of our councillors, who was the chair of a council-funded outside body which advised the council over its local plan, was stung by the Daily Telegraph after telling a journalist posing as a planning agent that I don't come cheap when it comes to making sure a planning application can get through the committee. He was told to resign, but the episode has made transparency a key issue in East Devon local elections, and that is why my cabinet position exists. I don't believe there is such a cabinet position anywhere else in the country. East Devon wasn't one of the 50 councils surveyed by Transparency International, but upon being appointed to my cabinet role, I've been able to start addressing some of the systemic weaknesses within our planning system. One is within the pre-application process, in which we have a member advisory panel for meetings with developers for major applications. Until last month, there were no notes taken at these meetings, which gave the public and some councillors the perception that secretive lobbying was being allowed to take place. We changed this by bringing a report to the last cabinet at East Devon, which adopted Transparency International's first recommendation in full, which means from now on that all pre-application meetings between the council and major developers will be minuted to committee standard by an officer from the council's democratic services team, and further that those minutes will be included within the paperwork of any future application. This report was met with complete cross-party support and was adopted by the council with unanimous support last week. Our protocol is also reflected in the constitution so the public can see it, and we feel it will actually increase public confidence in the council. But I will say this is only one recommendation from this brilliant report that we've adopted so far. So I'm aware that on its own it is no panacea. There is so much more we need to do, and some of that was mentioned by Liz with our code of conduct, our gifts register, and also managing the revolving door by ensuring what happened 8 years ago at East Devon can never come close to happening again. So that's me.
Thanks very much, Paul. It's really great to hear about the positive steps that you've been taking. I think Councillor Leslie Wybrow from Folkestone and Hythe also had a couple of comments to make.
Yes, I have. Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, I missed the beginning because I couldn't get into the meeting, so I didn't hear all the presentation, but I've read the report, and I've also got the detailed recommendations from my council, which has been very useful. So I've taken that to the Chief Executive. I haven't got anywhere with it yet, but I will keep pushing. I'm a little bit dubious about some of the comments about reducing discretion in planning, because that also reduces democracy. So I would really put my emphasis on transparency. But I mean, clearly, I would agree the developers have far too much weight in these decisions, and the public opinion counts for next to nothing. So that balance needs to be readdressed. I would also agree. I think, the one recommendation from my council that I've picked out has been to get those meetings between the councillors and the developers minuted and put into the public domain, because I think a lot of the public don't even know that those meetings happen. I think our Chief Planning Officer actually is very straight and very professional, but he's very keen on these meetings to sort of try and get the problems ironed out before it gets to the planning committee. But that means that none of it's done in the open, and absolutely needs to be more open than it is at the moment. I also think, there is a big reluctance, I think, to actually take complaints against councillors through. Just about every complaint that's been put against the councillors since I've been elected has not gone anywhere. And a lot of them are trivial, so I can understand why that happens, but it means people have no faith in the complaint system. So I just have to congratulate you on this work. So it's been very useful for the campaigning that I'm doing within my council. So keep it up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. It's really good to hear about what's been happening on the ground and what the challenges are that you're facing. If I could now ask Stephen Tosh to ask the question that he submitted before the event.
Stephen might not be on just at the moment. Are you able to ask the question?
Okay, if I could put this to the panel then on his behalf. Is there ever a possibility of a consistent approach to anti-corruption by local authorities when each authority manages or considers areas such as corruption and organised crime risk within procurement differently? And this obviously picks up on some of the comments that Liz was making about the scrapping of a national code of conduct and individual councils deciding how they handle codes of conduct and gift registers. John, if I could put that to you first, please.
Yeah, sure. There's a really important tension here, isn't there, between localism. The local councils have got their powers; they are democratically elected. So you don't want to have someone like me or Whitehall or Westminster thinking that it knows best, but also making sure that everybody is properly equipped to to understand what best practice is and get closest to it. It's also worthwhile saying that the risks which each council will face, not just in planning, but actually in things like local procurement of public services or anything from toilet rolls on through, that is also another source of corruption. But again, depending on the local supply chain, that can be something where there are widespread national best practice ideas, but you're still going to have a local take on it in order to deal with the local situation. So my sense is that yes, it makes huge sense to have some national proposals, best practice, so that everybody can see and understand what good looks like. And then this kind of operation, which Transparency International has done to sort of grade people on how they're doing against it, and political pressure to say, hang on, why is my council either doing really well or alternatively actually doing really badly? And then the councils can say, yeah, actually, no, we think that's unfair. We think we're doing it this way, and here's why we think our process is good. But just having a proper public debate and getting the public square energized once we've got a template to say, here's what good looks like, why is my council different? Alternatively, hey, hang on, my council's really good. That can take us an enormously long way just by getting that template out there, and then challenging councils to measure up and to justify themselves to their local residents against it.
Rachel, do you have anything you'd like to add on that? Yeah,
I mean, the person who asked this question is right. There's not a lot of consistency between councils. Let's take gifts and hospitality. 13% of authorities we looked at ban their councillors from taking any gifts. Others don't. Some people require gifts and hospitality registers, others don't. And I think there is a greater need for more consistency. I would really encourage councils to make use of bodies such as the LGA. So, for example, the LGA is well placed to provide training on probity in the planning process, but not many councils have actually taken them up on that. And I would love to see actually training be mandatory for councillors involved in that. So I agree. We need to keep planning, the power of making these decisions at the local level, and not remove that from local authorities. But it would be great to see more consistency on certain elements, such as gifts and hospitality and training.
Liz, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I mean, just quickly to say that I think, part of the reason that we really need a consistent approach is because actually the risks do vary, but also the resources of councils vary quite a lot. Some councils have got fantastic compliance departments and audit departments with a lot of skills and resources, and some just don't. And so I think one of the reasons that national consistency and national standards are important is to try to level out some of those inequalities. And while the risks might differ locally, there's no reason for standards to differ locally. Integrity should be the same across the board.
Thanks, Liz. Is Matthew Scott here to ask his question?
Yep. Hello. Yeah, I'm a community worker working in Barking and Dagenham. Just a few quick points for the question. I think that in my experience, a lot of councillors don't really get to see the detail of development in the first place, and that's an issue around the kind of leader and cabinet model that's there. Likewise, I think there needs to be an awful lot of investment in civil society in order to affect real deep knowledge about the planning system. And likewise, I'm not sure whether it's in the report, but a lot of councils are now adopting their own arm's length development arms. And so therefore, a lot of the planning departments become developers rather than safeguarders of public interest. The question I had really in terms of the solution and action is, I think in terms of good practice, whether it's Portsmouth or wherever, that these are quite kind of fragile plants. So my analysis is really that the issue is structural, and that what we require is government legislation to act as a kind of enforcement of transparency and independent council decision making. So I just wanted to ask the panel whether they agree with that analysis, that really the long-term solution to this is a fundamental change in legislation with which to completely alter the terms in which planning and development is enacted.
Liz, do you think we need a national legislative framework?
I generally think that legislation is only part of the solution. So the problem with legislation is that not everybody enforces it in the same way or implements it in the same way. So I would probably be in favour of some softer approaches. So, for example, I think one of the things that we lost with the Audit Commission was an independent body that was looking at what are the emerging risks across the whole sector and just doing some thinking about how to counter those risks. So if we could somehow substitute that now, perhaps by creating some kind of forum or platform for the bodies that are engaged in auditing local government, perhaps that could play part of that role. So I think legislation only goes part of the way, would be my answer.
John, do you think that's that a national legislative framework is the right approach?
I'd be in the same camp as Liz on this one. I put it right at the back of my list of priorities, just because there's a really, I think, sad pendulum around localism and local authority powers, and left to itself, Westminster will slowly erode local councils' powers and gather more power to itself. And I don't think that's a helpful thing. I don't think it's a democratic thing. And I think that there's an enormous amount which councils can and probably will, if we get the other things right, do for themselves, because it's in their interests. It's in councillors' interests to get this right, because it protects them as much as anything else. So I would want to try everything else before we start to centralise power and strip responsibility away from local councils first.
Rachel, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I mean, I agree. We want to keep the responsibility and the power at the local level. I think there are certain things that could be changed in terms of legislation at the central level, which, rather than taking power away from local authorities, can give them more power to act, particularly in terms of serious misconduct. So, for example, the Committee on Standards in Public Life made a recommendation that we agree with, which would be that the government should legislate to give local authorities more powers to suspend councillors, for example, when there are breaches of misconduct. And I think that would help sort of act as a deterrent effect against breaches of the Code of Conduct. So I do think there is a role for central government legislation, but I don't think that has to mean taking power away from local authorities. I think it could mean the opposite.
Okay, we've had some very good questions on the chat, which I'm just going to go to now. We're running a little bit behind time, so I'm afraid I'm just going to ask the questions. So apologies to the people who have posted their questions. But Robert Barrington has asked about the issue that's already been raised around the Audit Commission, and said that when the Audit Commission was abolished, the Secretary of State said an army of citizen auditors would fill the gap. Do the panel think this is realistic?
Can I come in?
Go for it.
I don't think this is realistic. I think for a number of reasons. First of all, resources. How many people would have the time to do this, to actually monitor everything coming out of local government? I think it's also, as we've already discussed in this event, there's a real disparity in terms of transparency. So the information isn't always there, or if it is, it's quite hard to access. So, for example, with gifts and hospitality registers and other information on financial interests, some of this information is published in PDF format in very obscure parts of the local government website. And we actually found it easier to find these things through Google than actually using the website menu. And I also think, you need knowledge and expertise to do this well. I would say this would be a paid qualified profession, probably not a hobby. And finding people with the right skills and experience of knowing how to find the information in the first place is problematic.
John, do you think the army of citizen auditors is realistic?
Well, I pick up on Rachel's point. I think that it is realistic if there is enough transparency to make the information relatively easily available. And the thing that's changed since since Eric Pickles made that comment 10 years ago, is that the digital revolution has advanced dramatically in that time. And so it should be easier than ever for that army of armchair auditors plus civil society organisations like Transparency International. Incidentally, is that the Robert, in the interest of fair disclosure, is that the Robert Barrington who might previously have led Transparency International? Just to make sure we've got full transparency here. Is that the same person?
Yes.
Yeah, probably might be. Hi, Robert. So it should be possible if the information is available and searchable, as Rachel says. Where it isn't, then we have a structural impediment to it ever working properly. And so I think Robert is absolutely right to say, if you haven't got the information in the first place, then it doesn't matter who you are, citizen auditor or anyone else, it ain't going to work properly in any case.
If I can just add in, John, there's been a follow-up question to Robert's question from Dan Rittman about if we are hoping for this army of citizen auditors and people are looking at the data and hopefully that's improving, how can local people and groups detect instances of corruption in council decisions and press for anti-corruption measures? What can people actually do?
Well, this is the point which I think both Liz and Rachel were making earlier on. I think they're absolutely right. You've got to have an effective mechanism then for doing the equivalent in MP terms of either getting a police investigation going, that is obviously available for councils as well, or alternatively the equivalent of reporting them to the Standards and Privileges Board as an independent board so that they can be properly and independently investigated, and that there are then consequences which can follow. And the equivalent for MPs would be, for example, the recall legislation, which can spark a by-election if someone's found guilty of having done something which they shouldn't. And I think both Rachel and Liz have rightly made the point that in a lot of cases, those mechanisms just don't exist. So yes, you can still take things to the police. That's okay in the most serious cases. And there is a trickle of cases. We've heard a couple of them mentioned already today. But it isn't enough. And that's why I would strongly support both Liz and Rachel's point that you've got to have an internal process that is not only robust to stop vexatious party political complaints, which happen to happen about 6 weeks before the local elections, which is always a risk, but also which have teeth and which are properly rigorous and run effectively, because otherwise the citizen auditors may find things, they may scream about them, but nothing flipping well happens, and that isn't acceptable either.
Liz, do you have anything you'd like to add on those questions?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I agree very much with what both John and Rachel have said, but I think, one thing is at the centre, at the Centre for the Study of Corruption, we often get emails from people about corruption allegations or concerns they have about corruption. That's not something that we as a research and teaching centre can deal with, but I'm struck by how I don't really know where to send them often, and that there isn't somebody where I can say, well, actually, if you've got these concerns, you should address them to this body and they will look into it. So I think that's a problem, and there is a patchwork of different solutions. Some councils will have standards committees that you could take these to, but overall I think that's something where a national approach might be helpful.
One issue that always gets put whenever we discuss any kind of corruption issues, whether it's at local government, national government, whether it's lobbying or planning, is the idea that, as Rachel said, that it's just somehow kind of a few bad apples. It's an individual that has done something wrong, rather than a systemic problem. If I could just ask the panel to reflect on that, and whether or not you feel it is an issue with just a few bad apples. And Liz, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. So this is something we're constantly thinking about in studying corruption and how to tackle it. And essentially the people who are actually committing corruption are usually in the minority. Most people who are in public service are there to serve the public. But the problem is that when you've got systemic weaknesses, then these bad apples can pop up more easily, and they can also, to follow the analogy, make the whole barrel go rotten. So we do see classic cases where there is one initial instance of corruption, but everybody sees that there's no action taken against that, and hence it starts to mushroom, and other people take advantage of those opportunities too. So this is, I think, the classic learning here is that if you put in place good institutions that provide transparency so everybody can see what's going on, and that you can then ask questions, and that there is someone who listens when you ask questions about that and try to hold them to account, then you can close down those systemic risks. And while you might never get to a situation where there are no bad apples, you can at least stop the rot or the spread.
If I can come in, I think it's worth noting that even a small number of bad apples can actually have quite a big impact on trust and, from communities. And I think, what we found in our report, we didn't look at sort of instances of corruption across the whole. We looked at where there is a risk of impropriety that can then lead to corrupt behaviour, and that risk was systematic across the board. I think, as we've discussed, the average score from councils was 38 out of 100, which means that we have weak systems in place across the board. And I agree with Liz. I think when you don't have the right structures in place, that can give rise to bad apples engaging in corrupt behaviour quite easily.
John, do you have anything you want to add to that before I put the final question to you?
Just very short. I think that's absolutely right. What both Liz and Rachel have said. It's bad apples matter, but it isn't just bad apples. Institutions and processes and systems feed into a culture, and so culture and all those other things that lead to it matter too. So yeah, bad apples are an issue, and any organisation that has human beings in it will be just as prey to human frailties as any other organisation, and local councils are no more exempt from that rule than anywhere else. But systems and processes and culture matters too. And so we can't just ignore that and say it's only a few people. It will colour everybody and lead good people astray if you let the wrong culture develop because the wrong institutions and the wrong processes are in place.
Thanks, John. We've had a really good discussion today about the risks of corruption in local government planning decisions, as well as some of the more positive news around what councils can do and what some councils are doing to proactively mitigate those. I just wanted to ask you, John, particularly in your role as the government anti-corruption champion, what you'll be taking forward from today's discussion, and what you will be asking of the government around these risks.
So, very fair question. There's already some work ongoing. I mentioned earlier on local government procurement, and there's an important local report into that came out a month or two back now, where I think we're starting to take some steps there, which is necessary and important, and I think overdue. This, I think, is the other big area which erodes trust, isn't it? So, what I'd like to see, and I think one of the things which I want to do is to perhaps speak to people at the LGA and say, how do we help councils do the right thing? How do we create that framework of what good looks like? Which I think is, as I said, is not rocket science. It's not new. It's not brand new thinking. It exists in many places already. But how do we crystallise that and help more councils do it well and measure it well? Because the point I will make, I think, to the LGA is if councils need to be doing this for themselves, to themselves, in order to make sure that somebody else doesn't come along and disempower them by trying to do it to them from central government. And the LGA and the individual members of the LGA get this. They are councillors understand the importance of trying to do the right thing and be seen to do the right thing. So I would hope I'll be pushing an open door, and I'm pretty sure. I'm hoping, Rachel, I'm about to take you in vain here, but I'm your name in vain and Transparency International in vain as well. But I'm hoping that organisations like Transparency International will be part of that group. I'd expect us to be pushing an open door there and to find a warm reception. But I think that is step one. Let's make sure that councils know what they've got to do and help them do it. and then let's see which ones are still lagging behind once we've given them that chance to do the right thing.
Thanks, John. I'd like to thank all of our speakers today and everybody who's participated for what's been a really important discussion that set out what are very serious risks, but also the ways that we can mitigate those. And it's been really positive to hear from councillors about what they're doing on the ground. And it's been particularly good to hear about the need both for the combination of transparency and robust mechanisms for what we do when we have that data and we have that information. And obviously that's something that Transparency International cares a lot about. And for those who are more interested in our work, you can find more on our website. And I think my colleague Susanna has already been posting links to our report in the chat. In the coming months, we also have new research coming out on access and influence in UK housing policy and exploring corruption risks in UK public procurement during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we'd also just finally like to thank the Julia and Hans Rousing Trust, the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust and the Carlo Schmidt Programme for their generous support for this work. And as I said earlier, if you'd like to know more about Transparency International and how you can support us and our work, please have a look at our website. Thank you very much.